Welcome back to The Innovative Teacher. Today we're stepping into a much bigger picture conversation. In our last episodes, we explored what virtual reality is and the impact immersive learning can have. But to really understand why these approaches matter, we need to zoom out and look at education itself, where it came from, how it evolved, and why it's changing again now. Because education systems don't just appear fully formed. They're shaped by the world around them. They reflect the needs, priorities, and assumptions of the time in which they were built. What schools prioritize, how learning is structured, what success looks like, and even what counts as knowledge. All of these are influenced by social, cultural, and economic conditions. Education is never neutral. It's a response. And when the world changes, education eventually changes too. Sometimes slowly, sometimes unevenly, but always in relation to what learners will need beyond the classroom. To understand why immersive learning is becoming more relevant, and in many cases more necessary, it helps to look at the broader story of how education has evolved. We can think about this evolution in three broad phases: the industrial age, the information age, and what many educators now describe as the experience age. And what's important to understand is that this shift isn't mainly about technology. It's about pedagogy. It's about culture. It's about systems. Technology only becomes meaningful when it aligns with those deeper shifts in how learning is understood. Let's start with the industrial foundations of modern schooling. Much of what we recognize as school today was shaped during the Industrial Revolution. At that time, societies needed large numbers of people prepared for predictable, structured roles. Work was often repetitive, procedural, and standardized. Efficiency mattered. Consistency mattered. Scale mattered. So education systems were designed with those priorities in mind. Students were grouped by age rather than readiness or interest. Learning was divided into subjects and fixed time blocks. Knowledge was delivered in sequences. Assessment focused on standardized measures. Teachers were positioned as the primary sources of information. Underlying all of this was a particular assumption: that knowledge could be transmitted, absorbed, and reproduced reliably. Success was measured by accuracy, compliance, and recall. And it's important to acknowledge that this model worked. It worked extraordinarily well for the world it was built for. It enabled mass literacy and numeracy on a scale never seen before. It prepared generations of learners for the workforce demands of the time. It was optimized for a world where information was scarce, career pathways were stable, and change happened slowly enough that what you learned early in life could serve you for decades. But while the world has transformed dramatically, many of those original structures are still with us. You can see them in rigid timetables, content-heavy curricula, and assessment systems that emphasize narrow measures of success. You can see them in the expectation that learning should move at the same pace for everyone, or that understanding can be demonstrated primarily through written recall. These structures persist not because educators are resistant to change, but because large systems value stability, equity, and accountability. Those are important priorities, yet they can sometimes create tension when the world outside school evolves faster than the structures inside it. If you look at how students learn outside of school, you'll often notice something different. They learn through interaction, through exploration, through experimentation, through digital environments, games, videos, and social platforms. They learn visually, socially, and dynamically. Inside school, learning can still be dominated by listening, reading, and abstraction. And when those two worlds feel disconnected, students don't necessarily lose ability. They lose connection. The issue isn't that they can't learn. It's that the learning environment may not match how they experience understanding in other parts of their lives. Then came what we call the information age. With the rise of computers, the internet, and mobile devices, access to information changed almost overnight. Suddenly, knowledge was no longer scarce. It was everywhere. Education responded by introducing digital tools into classrooms. Laptops, tablets, interactive displays, online platforms, learning management systems. These tools brought real benefits. They improved access. They made resources easier to share. They allowed learning to happen beyond physical classrooms. They increased efficiency and organization. But in many cases, they didn't fundamentally change how learning worked. Worksheets became digital worksheets. Textbooks became PDFs. Lectures became videos. Tests moved online. The format changed, but the underlying structure often stayed the same. And this created a kind of paradox. Students had more access to information than any generation in history. Teachers had more tools than ever before. Yet engagement, deep understanding, and transfer of learning didn't automatically improve. Technology modernized schooling, but it didn't necessarily transform it. As information became abundant, its value shifted. Knowing facts became less important than knowing how to use them. Being able to recall information mattered less than being able to interpret it, evaluate it, apply it, and adapt it. Skills like critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, and problem-solving became central. But these skills can't be developed through instruction alone. They require context. They require decision-making. They require practice. And they require reflection. When learning systems focus primarily on content delivery, they can struggle to support those outcomes. Students may perform well on tests yet find it difficult to apply what they've learned in unfamiliar situations. Understanding can remain compartmentalized, tied to a specific task rather than transferable to new contexts. This gap between knowledge and application is one of the defining challenges of contemporary education. And that brings us to where we are now, what many educators describe as the experience age. In this era, value is increasingly created through participation, interaction, and meaning-making. Across industries, learning doesn't happen only through instruction. It happens through simulation, practice, and feedback. Training often involves realistic scenarios. People practice before they perform. Failure is treated as information, not as a final judgment. In the experience age, learning is active rather than passive. Understanding is constructed rather than delivered. Knowledge is applied in context rather than memorized in isolation. Education is now being asked to make this same shift, not because it's fashionable but because the world learners are entering demands it. Experience-based learning itself isn't new. Educators have long recognized the value of hands-on exploration, inquiry, and reflection. What has changed is our capacity to design and scale meaningful experiences. Traditionally, schools have faced real constraints. Cost can limit access to equipment or excursions. Safety can restrict certain kinds of experimentation. Time can limit how deeply students can explore a concept. Geography can prevent access to particular environments or expertise. Because of these constraints, education has often relied on abstraction, describing something rather than experiencing it. This is where immersive technology becomes significant. Not because it's impressive but because it can reduce those constraints. Virtual and mixed reality environments allow students to enter contexts instead of imagining them. They can interact with systems rather than just describing them. They can see consequences unfold rather than speculating about them. Instead of reading about a process, they can observe it. Instead of imagining scale, they can inhabit it. Instead of being told about different perspectives, they can experience them. That shift from abstraction to experience has important implications for learning. When students engage directly with a concept, they're more likely to build durable understanding. Experiences tend to be remembered more strongly than explanations alone. And when students can apply what they learn in context, they're more likely to transfer that learning to new situations later. But it's important to emphasize something here. Immersive learning doesn't remove the need for structure. In fact, it increases it. Experiences need framing, guidance, and reflection to become meaningful learning. Without those elements, an experience can remain interesting but superficial. With them, it can become transformative. This relevance extends across all stages of education. In early years settings, learning is naturally experiential. Young learners explore through movement, touch, sound, and play. In primary years, curiosity, language development, and spatial awareness are central. In secondary years, students begin working with systems, abstractions, and complex relationships. In senior and vocational pathways, learning often involves procedural practice, decision-making, and realism. Across all of these phases, Experiential approaches support progression from concrete experience to abstract understanding when they're used intentionally. And this brings us to one of the most important shifts in the experience age: the role of the teacher. Sometimes when new technologies emerge, there's a concern that they might replace or diminish the teacher's role. But in practice, the opposite tends to be true. As learning environments become more dynamic, the need for professional expertise grows. Teachers become designers of learning experiences. They become guides of inquiry. They become facilitators of reflection. Pedagogical knowledge becomes even more valuable, because the effectiveness of any learning environment depends on how it's used. Without clear intent, immersive experiences can become distractions. With thoughtful design, they become catalysts for understanding. The difference lies not in the technology but in the teaching. That's why the shift from industrial-era education isn't about abandoning knowledge or rigor. It's about rethinking how they're used. Structure doesn't disappear, it becomes scaffolding. Knowledge isn't discarded, it becomes a tool. Assessment doesn't vanish, it evolves to value application, reasoning, and reflection alongside recall. When this shift begins to take hold, schools start to feel less like factories and more like learning cultures. They become places where curiosity is supported, exploration is encouraged, and growth is visible. But that kind of transformation can't happen through isolated classroom practice alone. It requires alignment across systems. Curriculum, assessment, professional learning, leadership, infrastructure, and culture all need to move in the same direction. Without that alignment, innovative approaches risk being absorbed back into older models, used in ways that limit their potential. When alignment does happen, something powerful occurs. Immersive and experiential learning stop being add-ons. They stop being special events or occasional activities. Instead, they become part of how learning is designed every day. They shape how understanding is demonstrated, how progress is recognized, and how quality is defined. At that point, immersive learning isn't something a school uses. It's part of how the school teaches. As you reflect on this evolution, from industrial age structures, to information age access to experience age learning, you might notice that the conversation isn't really about technology at all. It's about alignment. Alignment between what we know about learning and how learning is designed. Alignment between the skills students need and the environments we create for them. Alignment between educational values and educational practice. So when we talk about the future of education, it's not a question of whether change will happen. Change has always been happening. The real question is how intentionally we engage with it. Do we react to change after it arrives, or do we prepare for it in advance? Do we adopt tools because they're new or because they serve a clear learning purpose? Do we design learning around convenience or around understanding? These are the kinds of questions that define innovative teaching. Not because innovation is about novelty, but because it's about responsiveness. It's about recognizing when the world has shifted and adjusting our practice to match it. The educators who make the greatest impact aren't necessarily the ones using the newest tools. They're the ones who understand why they're using them, when they matter, and how they support learning. This episode has been about seeing education as an evolving system, understanding how historical context shaped schooling, why those structures persist, what changed during the information age, and why the experience age is now influencing how learning is designed. When you see that bigger picture, immersive approaches stop looking like trends and start looking like natural next steps in a long educational journey. In our next episode, we'll build on this by exploring school-wide integration, looking at how immersive and innovative practices can move beyond individual classrooms and become part of a cohesive, whole-school approach to teaching and learning. Until then, keep observing, keep reflecting, and keep thinking like an innovative teacher. As always, thanks for listening.